The first principle and basic nature of all things is water. In this episode of Philosophers Explained by me, Stephen Hicks, we go to the beginnings of Western philosophy and Thales, often labeled the father of philosophy. Over 2,500 years ago, part of the challenge here is we do not have original texts from Thales, rather reports and ascriptions to Thales by later thinkers. But given what we have, let's go to the text. So why does philosophy begin with Thales? And that's the standard claim, that philosophy begins with Thales. Now, when I teach this issue to my students in my philosophy courses, it really is a hard sell initially, for here are the founding texts in philosophy ascribed to Thales by Aristotle, and there are two of them, and they're a little bit cryptic. Number one, the first principle and basic nature of all things is water, and all things are full of gods. Now, if those are the founding texts of philosophy, and you imagine teaching these to undergraduate students, you can imagine how impressed they are and excited they are at what we have to work with. Now, some interpretation obviously is necessary, so why is it that historians of philosophy get excited, get worked up over these lines and say, this is the beginning of philosophy? So to see their significance, what I would like to do is to set up a context by going back to Homer, the awesomely great Homer, and sketching out his worldview, which is mythic, narrative, epic poetry, and very sophisticated, but not philosophy as we use the phrase. So we'll use that as our contrast object. I don't know whether you are brushed up on your Iliad, but I'm going to use an excerpt from the Iliad as our pre-philosophy worldview contrast object. So it'll be Homer's mythology, narrative, and Thales as the beginnings of philosophy. So Homer, let's turn to Homer. Homer is thought to have lived a century and a half, 2 centuries prior to Thales. And so Thales, we think, is born around 624 BCE. Now, Homer is just great. The Iliad and the Odyssey, they are magnificent expressions of archaic Greek culture, and they are really of incalculable importance to the Greek way of thinking about human life and its place in the universe. So what I want to do is focus on one major event in Homer's Iliad to illustrate a pre-philosophical yet sophisticated view of reality. And the episode is going to be the death of Hector. Now, why did Hector die? And so we're asking a question about this event. We're looking for the cause. We're looking for the explanation for it. And we can imagine, as Homer invites us to imagine, Hector's father, Priam, the king of Troy. He's in anguish, asking, why did my son die? And then Hector's wife doing the same in her own private anguish. And Hector and his wife have a young son who's going to grow up and ask himself that question. Why did my father die? So it's an important question. And the answer is, well, Hector died because Achilles killed him. But then, of course, we are human beings and we know to ask the next question. Well, why did Achilles kill him? And here we can talk about the broad context. The Greeks are at war with the Trojans. And then we can talk more about, well, why were the Greeks at war with the Trojans? Or we can talk in a more specific context. Well, why particularly did Achilles kill particularly Hector? And then we would say more specifically, well, Achilles, that warrior, he wanted revenge for the death of Patroclus, his great friend. And so in each case, we are tracing back a causal chain. Hector died because Achilles killed him. Well, why in particular did Achilles kill him? And what was the broader context within which these two were fighting in the first place. So let's focus on the broad context for a few moments. Well, why then were the Greeks and the Trojans fighting? Well, and then Homer tells us a complicated story here. Young Paris, the Trojan, and Helen, the Greek, they fell in love. And so love is part of the causal story here. Unfortunately for them, Helen was married to Menelaus, the powerful king of Sparta. And so Menelaus is outraged. He's an older guy married to a younger woman, so that we might bring in some other causal factors here. But nonetheless, he became a cuckold. That's humiliating. He wants vengeance. And that's going to be part of the reason why the Greeks and the Trojans go to war. He was the brother of Agamemnon, the great, perhaps the most powerful king of the Greeks. And Agamemnon had a great ambition for power. Achilles is then recruited as a great warrior. He is recruited into the war, and he wants glory, and so on. So in Homer's world, what we have are the key motivations of human beings, the ones that drive human action being delineated. Love is part of the story, revenge, power, glory, and all of those are operative, and they are then played out through these key representative individuals. So Helen and love, Menelaus and revenge, Agamemnon and power, Achilles and glory. And so all of these are part of the causal story, why the Greeks go to war with the Trojans leading up to the specific event of Achilles killing Hector. But the important point here is then that this is naturalistic explanation so far, and we will come right back to this point. Human beings are natural creatures with natural desires, and their actions are explained in terms of natural motivations. Now we can go then to the specific context. Well, Patroclus was killed. And then it was taking revenge for Patroclus' death that leads Achilles to kill Hector. Well, why did Patroclus get killed? And we say, well, Homer tells us a story here. He was a young man. Young men like to prove themselves, so he went out and he did something risky and perhaps reckless and got himself killed. At the same time, Achilles was not around to protect him because Achilles was sulking in his tent and not participating in the war at all. Well, why was he sulking in his tent? Well, because Agamemnon, the chief of the army here, he had stolen a girl, and Achilles thought that girl properly belonged to him, so he was sulking as a result of that. So we have all of these particular actions that are going on. They also are particularly contributing to the particular event of Achilles killing Hector in this much broader context. Now, this is a very sophisticated story. It's magnificent literature. And then the philosophical point I want to make is that all of this is naturalistic explanation in terms of human agency. So we have a very complicated interplay of human desires and human motivations and human actions and reactions, and those are the causal explanation for major events like the Trojan War, and then if we're interested in specific events like the death of Hector. But Homer's story is more complicated because the gods are also an important and perhaps actually essential part of the causal matrix here. So Homer, as the great battle between Achilles and Hector is looming, Homer turns away from what's going on in the natural world with the humans and turns our attention to the gods and the goddesses. And all of the gods and goddesses are watching the war with great interest. So we see Zeus, he's watching Hector being chased by Achilles, and he's torn between his love for Hector and his admiration for Achilles. Whom should he favor in this conflict? And he can't decide, and he finds the tension, it's unbearable for him, and he calls upon the other gods and goddesses who are there for some advice. So I will put on my Zeus voice here. Come, you mortals, think this through, decide. Either we pluck the man from death and save his life, or strike him down at last, here at Achilles' hands. And the numbers in parentheses are where you can find this text in Homer's Iliad. Now, at that point, Athena protests. The decision should be done, she thinks, and Zeus ends up agreeing with her that Hector should die. So he tells her, "Go, do as your own impulse bids you, hold back no more." So he launched Athena, already poised for action, down the goddess swept from Olympus's craggy peaks. Athena then tricks Hector by impersonating his brother Deiphobus. This means Hector then stops running because he wants to greet his brother, but that allows Achilles to catch up with him and to kill him. And so Hector is now dead. All right, so let's pause with Homer's text here and do some extraction. What's going on in Homer's world? What is his worldview? How much can we pull out from this pregnant story? So what are the metaphysical lessons then of Homer's world? I want to say that there, I think, are 5 things that we can pull out from that. First, in Homer's world, naturalistic human agency alone does not cause events on Earth. The gods and the goddesses are active participants. Their desires, their decisions, their actions are important. Zeus could have decided differently. Athena could have switched her affection. She often does. And consequently, Hector's fate and the outcome of the Trojan War could have been very different depending on what the gods and goddesses decided. Second, and a closely related point, in Homer's world, the supernatural are the more important and powerful causal forces. If the gods decide against something, it will not happen. And if the gods decide that something is going to happen, it will. Human agency is a power, but it is a lesser power. Now, a third theme that we can pull out from Homer is that the gods and goddesses are often whimsical in themselves and then divided amongst themselves. So Zeus is often driven by his changeable passions. He's all over the place sometimes. He gets into quarrels with Athena and the others. There is, consequently, in this worldview, there's no stable and no predictable causal order in the natural world. It is going to be whimsical and subject to unpredictable change depending on what's going on with the gods and the goddesses. Now, as parenthetically, I do want to say that there is a kind of notion that's at work in Homer and his worldview. It doesn't seem consistent to me. Its role is not clear to me. I'm not a scholar of Homer at that level of detail, so I'm going to set that to the side in this discussion. Now, there's a fourth point that we can pull out that's important, and it concerns ethics in Homer's worldview. Why do we worship the gods? And it's not because they are moral. It's because they are powerful. The gods are, when we read the Homeric and other stories, they're very far from morally admirable. They're given to a wide range of vices and foibles, and some of them are quite repulsive. So, what then is the source and purpose of justice and other morally important realities? We have these concepts. They seem important in our life. So where do we get them from? And what is the source of their authority, if they have any authority? Now, it's not to say that the concepts of right and wrong are foreign to the gods. They're not. But the gods are not clear on these concepts, and they are not consistent either in what they say or in what they do. And then if we look at human beings are not consistent in what they say and what they do with respect to good and bad. So what's the place of ethics in the universe? What's the place of morality, to use kind of a later linguistic phrase? It seems like it's at best tenuous. Consequently, and then a closely fifthly related point, it seems like amoral power rules the natural realm and beyond. This is not a world of justice and goodness. There may be justice and goodness in the world, but it's tenuous, it's sketchy, it's not clear, and it certainly is not ruling the universe as we get it in Homer's world. So with these abstractions that I'm trying to engage in from Homer's narrative, I think we can pull out 5 implicit metaphysical and ethical theses in Homer's worldview, and I'm going to just list them now, putting them through once again. So, supernatural causation is part of the explanation for natural events. Supernatural causation is more powerful than natural causation. The supernatural is personal. The gods and goddesses are persons with personalities, etc. Consequently, supernatural causation is sometimes whimsical, and so it's inconsistent. It makes long-range planning unreliable, and then consequently, ethics is a matter mostly of power. We revere gods and kings because they're not because they're just, rather, but because they are powerful being. Now, with this context, we are ready for the revolution to be initiated by Thales, some generations after Homer. What would happen if, consciously and explicitly, we rejected some or all of those 5 Homeric points? What would our account of the world look like, or at least start to look like? Now, to then do this a little more systematically, I'm going to assign labels to those 5 Homeric points that we pulled out. H1, I'm going to call it, supernatural causation is part of the natural world. H2, that supernatural causation is more powerful. H3, the supernatural is personal. H4, supernatural causation is whimsical, inconsistent, and so it makes long-range prediction unreliable. And then H5 will be the point about ethics, that ethics is mostly about power. We revere the gods not with respect to justice, but rather because they are very powerful beings. Now let's turn to Thales and the birth of a new worldview. So here's that first text again that we had from Thales, and I'll read it again. Quote, "The first principle and basic nature of all things is water." And now we start to unpack. Now notice that Thales' first principle is water. If it is water that is first, then it is not the gods that are first. The gods then become at most secondary. And so we have at least an implicit challenge to H2, the claim that the gods are the most powerful and prior thing with respect to causation in the world, right? It's first water. Second, we can pull out, if we focus on the word all, the basic nature of all things is water. But water is a natural phenomenon. It's not a supernatural phenomenon. So we have at least an implicit denial here of H1, the claim that the supernatural dimension exists and is important in the causal explanation of things. Now, that's then to say we have a natural phenomenon that is first and nature is all. Why water in particular? Because when we're looking at nature, we could be looking at lots of different things. Well, no doubt Thales had observed the weather cycle, as we all do. We observe the flowing of water into streams and out to the sea. We become aware that water is critically important to all living things. We notice the transformations. Water can be transformed into liquid and solid and then back again, from liquid to gas and then back again. And it does so with a regularity. So all of these observations, no doubt Thales is involved in them. But if, with all of these regularities, if water is the first principle of all things, then it follows that all of reality is regular. And so now we have at least an implicit challenge to H4, H4 being the one that the world is whimsical and chaotic and unpredictable. If all of nature is water and water is regular and subject of cycles, then all of nature is not whimsical, all of nature is not unpredictable. We can think about nature in a new way. So with this unpacking, already we are well on the way to thinking of nature in a self-contained way, not in terms of supernatural interjections at various points. Nature is a self-contained, it's self-governing, and it's a regular physical system of cause and effect. It's also quite clear that Thales' statement is based on observations of transformations from liquids to gas to solids and so on. So he's not basing his views on traditional stories, these narratives, these myths that have just been handed down through the ages, and we accept them and we enjoy them as stories and we reflect on them, but at a basic level, somewhat uncritically. Instead, we are starting with our own observations of nature, not with stories that are coming down to us. And we are offering explanatory hypotheses for those observations. And so observation integrated with explanation, that is the hallmark of a naturalistic and philosophical approach. It's also important that very quickly, subsequent Presocratics, that is to say Socrates before, philosophers and intellectuals before Socrates, they argued with Thales. And this is an important issue, that you're going to argue with this person putting forth this hypothesis. And again, we can do the contrast. You hear a Homeric story, your mother or your father reads it to you, or some orator is telling the story around a campfire at night. Well, you don't argue with the orator about Homer's story, about whether it's true or false, and did Homer get it right or not. You accept the story for what it is. But the Presocratics are arguing with Thales. Anaximander, for example, he said, well, look, I think fire is a better first principle candidate than water is. And Heraclitus agreed with Anaximander here. Anaximander, he's another Presocratic, my favorite as it happens. He argued that Anaximenes and Thales were being too reductionist. They're trying to take all of the complexity of nature and reduce it to just one thing, fire or water. And so he thought instead that water and earth and air and fire were independent, but they were in this cyclical transformation process out of what he called a boundless state. And there are lots of other pre-Socratic philosophers who entered into the philosophical fray. And so the pre-Socratics are clearly using reason in a different way. Now, it's not clear to me that these pre-Socratics so far are explicitly and self-conscious about these new methods of thinking. The content of the thinking, yes, but it's clear that they're not thinking in terms of Homeric principles. It might be, this is for another episode, that what we have is with Thales a metaphysical revolution away from the supernaturalism to the naturalism, as we've sketched it here, but that the epistemological revolution, an identification of how we are using reason with respect to explanation and logic and so forth, that comes a little bit later with Parmenides. That's another hypothesis. So philosophy's different, constitutive branches, metaphysics and epistemology, might have different founding dates and different founders. Okay, but they are no longer clearly, these pre-Socratics, thinking in Homeric principles. And in fact, fairly quickly, Homer and the other more mythic accounts of the world started to be treated more skeptically, and in some cases outright scornfully. So here's Hector of Miletus. He's just 19 years when he dies before the birth of Socrates. He's representative of this new attitude with respect to the pre-philosophical myths, stories, and narratives. Quote, "What I write here is the account of what I considered to be true, for the stories of the Greeks are numerous and, in my opinion, ridiculous." So we have a contrast very clear between what's true and what's just stories, and all of this stuff about gods and goddesses and whimsical desires, right, and so forth. We're going to set all of that aside in the more radical forms of this new philosophical thinking and be naturalistic and see the world as self-contained and regular. So clearly, a new way of thinking has begun. Philosophy and the sciences have launched, and they flourish quickly in Greece and then the surrounding, influenced by Greece, environments. Now, I haven't said much about the ethics yet and the place of morality in the universe. I don't think we can find that in Thales. So as for H5 and where we get morality, where we get ethics, do we revere the gods or not? And if so, why? Do we rely on them for our moral standards? Do we make them up ourselves? All of that, the development of a philosophical approach to ethics, I think that story is worth a different episode, and it doesn't involve other giants like Hesiod and their innovations.